Distinguished guests, I would first like to express my appreciation to the India Foundation for inviting me here today, even though for a very brief moment, and to participate and listen to ideas in this conclave. It is true that in our world, where conflicts abound all around us, exchange of ideas will promote mutual understanding. So therefore, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the initiators, the creators of this idea through the India Foundation and the Ideas Conclave. The two speakers, the distinguished speakers before me have, I think, covered a large area of what we are discussing today, so therefore, fortunately, I can be brief. We were talking about the need for promoting nationalism, I think, as against terrorism and extremism. I agree. We know that the process of decolonization, which began around the time that India and Sri Lanka and most of the countries in our region, in South Asia, achieved independence. The process of decolonization, we know, created a new paradigm for a new world. A world of free nations, rich or poor, asking for equality, equal status, and recognition. In this new world, we saw the rise of identity politics, the demand for the recognition of specific identities of different nations, of diverse communities within nations, which led to all kinds of political activities, sometimes ending up in the breakup of ancient nations, the violent demand for separate states. Finally, this has been exacerbated to the point of terroristic politics. The demand for identity, recognition of identity, right or wrong, has led to much violence in our generation within the last, I would say, 75 years. The conflicts we see around us today in our world, almost all of them are also founded on the demand for identity. Identity of groups within nations, or identity of specific identities of different communities. Today, this situation has been further, I would say, exacerbated, with even the major world powers, rather than opening out, limiting themselves to promoting the specific interests of their nations. The recent America First policy adopted by the present American government is an example of this. We are talking of leadership. We know that leaders in general cannot follow their peoples they must lead them. Indeed, they must be sensitive to the people's needs, their desires and their hopes, but they must lead them towards enlightenment, towards what is right for the nation, but also towards what is right for the world. A world where diverse communities, diverse peoples, different nations intermingle together. A world which has, since the Second World War, been built up through cooperation between nations, through a common vision which has been enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and at the time of the creation of the United Nations organization. So, I think when we talk of leadership, we have to reflect upon, and I believe this is what you are probably going to do in the next 2 days, what leaders should do in the modern world, which is very different to the world we knew 7-8 decades ago, and what we should not do as leaders. Of course, leaders must recognize, promote, protect the specific identity of their nations, but they must also open up to the globalized world. And when I say also the specific identity of a nation, I do not mean only the identity of one group, the dominant group in a nation. I mean the collective identity of a nation, which is formed on the collective identities of all the communities living within that nation, with the recognition that each of the communities will have the right, which have the full right to equal status, will have the full right to protect their cultures, their religions, their social traditions, but that they must all come together in one nation, recognizing the national identity as one nation. We have seen in history good leaders and bad leaders, excuse my saying so, but there have been and there will be. Leaders who have used the diversity within their nations, exacerbated it to the point of conflict between different communities living within nations, who have lived together for centuries, sometimes for millennia, for their own personal political gains. I think, Excellency, you talked about it briefly. But there have also been leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, like Nelson Mandela, like Abraham Lincoln, who have gone beyond that, who have risen above that, to bring the nation together around one vision, around the interest of a nation, the nation which is comprised of all the communities living within that nation, through the recognition of diversity, the respect of diversity, of difference, of accepting and recognizing the differences within the nation, of the different communities, and not rejecting the differences. I would say this is essential at this moment in our modern world. Many of the conflicts we see around us, in our region, in the world, may not have existed or could be resolved if we have leaders with such a vision. Of course, leadership today in our world faces many difficult challenges as never before. I would like to mention a few of these challenges. One is the erosion of global governance mechanisms. As we know, our world today cannot exist in little compartments of nations living by themselves separately and deciding by themselves what the world should be. Of course, the nation can decide. The leaders and the nation, the people can decide what that specific nation should do, what their vision should be, and how they should go forward. But no nation today can exist isolatedly. We live, as we all know, in a globalized world. The global governance mechanisms are crucial, I believe, in our world. Regional governance, global governance. We must not allow these mechanisms of regional organizations, global organizations to be eroded because of narrow national interests. Sometimes, in order to maintain and promote peace within nations and global peace, every nation will have to give and take. At the moment, sometimes we become desperate to see that nations and their leaders seem to be incapable of thinking like in that fashion. The lack of leadership presently in the last many years has exacerbated regional conflicts. They have not been able to prevent sometimes even the results of major natural disasters. So I would say today's leaders in the 21st century will have to work together to strengthen the mechanisms, the institutions of global governance, of regional governance, rather than weaken them because two nations have a problem between them in a region, and therefore we must not allow, some people think, the regional mechanisms to work. This is, I would say, an absolute must. Added to this is the nuclear threat. Recently, it has become very serious and very close home to us, with North Korea threatening, I don't know, nuclear what? Maybe nuclear warfare. And our region, South Asia, also will have to work out mechanisms to manage this aspect, because the two major powers in our region are nuclear armed, and now we have so many others in Asia jumping into the arena and muddying the waters. Global leadership is urgently required in managing this matter. We despair at seeing the way the world is handling, for example, the Korean nuclear threat, the North Korean nuclear threat. Some leaders are making all kinds of statements. The global governance mechanism, the major one, the UN, seems helpless. The other nations are silent. This is not how leadership should act at this moment in a world which is enlightened, which is technologically highly advanced, which has every possibility of working together as never before to resolve this kind of major problems. So I would say this is also a major challenge to global leaders, not only to political leaders, but also to leaders of society. Business leaders, academics, intellectuals, professionals We have to all take leadership in this situation, and perhaps even persuade our political leaders to go along the right path. Leaders, when we talk of leaders, we do not only think of political leaders. Another challenge for leaders today is climate change, the immense threats posed by climate change. We talk of political terrorism, but I would say that the threats posed by climate change to countries and to the world is also a form of natural terror. A terrorism which has been certainly created by humanity, especially by our generation and that of our parents and grandparents, the last 3 generations. And now we have this global threat of terror posed by Mother Nature herself, who has been abused by us humans. Many powerful nations refuse to accept, I wouldn't say many, sorry, a few powerful nations refuse to accept that this threat exists. They only think in narrow compartments. They feel that if they can unlimitedly adopt any measures to develop their countries, maybe to eliminate poverty, to give development, economic emancipation to their peoples, let factories come up anywhere, deny the fact of carbon emissions. I don't see how leaders could even think like this, but it is happening. This is a very serious threat. I would say as serious as the threat of political terror, but it is not as evident. It takes a little longer to destroy, but it will destroy if we don't find solutions to it. And once again, solutions to the threat of climate change will have to begin. We'll have to find its springboard within nations, but it will have to be handled and managed globally through global organizations. The other threat I see is the explosion of crime in the modern day. Arms, narcotics, the slave trade. Our region is also not immune to this. This is another major area that nations and the global world will have to find solutions to. Even little nations in our region are seriously threatened by the narcotics trade, and some of us by the slave trade. In all of this, the technology revolution, the electronic communications / technology revolution has taken over the world. It has decided how the world should act, how leaders in government, in business, in industry, even in agriculture, in rural activities, how they should behave, how they should act, how they should communicate their decisions and their visions. Social media has taken over the world. We saw what happened in what was called the Arab Revolution. The social media dominated, even though it was short-lived, the social media dominated the whole process. One didn't need traditional arms to topple governments, to topple systems, to topple regimes. They simply used made use of the peaceful weapon of social media. My country saw the uses of this 3 years ago, when a ruthless regime was changed, I would say, without shedding one drop of blood, through entirely democratic means, by the civil society, together with political organizations, academics, professionals, religious leaders, most of them, all of them getting together. And in this whole revolution, social media played a crucial role. How do we handle this? How do we manage it? How do we move forward using it? I believe in India, your leader has mastered that art, but very few others have still moved towards that. All of this to say that, as I said a little while ago, leaders cannot follow all the trends of thought amongst their peoples. They have to base themselves, of course, on tradition, on the culture of their nations, but they have to move the nation forward. A nation cannot get stuck in narrow enclaves. A nation must move out of that. Of course, base itself on its traditions, on its culture, on their religious cultures, but nations have to recognize, and their leaders, that people do not get stuck in one place, that humanity moves forward all the time. And leaders have to move forward with that and evolve and formulate visions that will englobe the new technologies, the new discoveries, the new thinking of the modern world. We cannot continue to say, my culture said this 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, so we have to get stuck in that. If we are to move forward, if we are to build a world without poverty, build a world without ignorance, build a world where everybody will have free access to knowledge, to goods, to equal opportunities for education, for health services, we have to then modernize ourselves, of course, base ourselves on our own specific identities, but then move forward, absorbing what the world can give us. That doesn't mean that we will be less for that. We will not be less of an Indian or less of a Sri Lankan or less of an African or less of a Pakistani or whatever, less of an Arab, of a Muslim. If we accept the diversity that exists around us, if we celebrate that diversity, I believe that our own identity will be enriched by that, by the humaneness of that, by englobing and absorbing and including everybody in the forward march of a nation, in the forward march of an enlightened world, without conflict, without terror of all sorts, a world where we could all live in peace, where difference will be accepted, and where different groups and communities do not have to fear that they are different. With this thought, I shall end my little presentation, and I would like to take this opportunity once again to wish all of you who will be dialoguing for the next few days within this conclave and I'm sure you will evolve and come up with new ideas for an effective vision for a peaceful world. Thank you.